Welcome to Reflections, a program that turns back the pages of history, revealing the lives of heroes of faith from the past. And now our host, Jonathan Griffin.
Hello, and welcome to the Higher Grounds Podcast. This is today's episode of Reflections. Glad you tuned in today with us here. And today we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject here on the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a man by the name of Christmas Evans. He's a very interesting man. He was known as the one-eyed preacher from Wales. And you may or may not have heard of this man. I personally did not hear about him until some time back, but it has been my pleasure and my joy to study about him, and I hope today, in some way, that our podcast will be a blessing to you in our study of Christmas Evans. So, Christmas Evans, as you may have already guessed, was born December 25th, 1776, in the country of Wales. Now, if you look on a geographical map, Wales is a sandwich between the country of the United Kingdom, and you also have Ireland, so it's sandwiched between those two countries. And his early life, he was born into a very poor family. His father was a shoemaker by trade, and a very poor family. They were known as some of the poorest people to ever live in the country of Wales. And soon it grew much worse. When Christmas Evans was about the age of 9 years old, his father died. He was just working over in his shoe shop, and he just keeled over dead. Nobody really knows what caused this, but after that, the family became so poor and didn't have enough money to take care of little Christmas Evans, so they sent him away to live with his uncle, Lewis Evans. And that was some of the worst years of Christmas Evans' life. He said later on, referring to his uncle, he said it would be very hard to find a more unconscionable man in all the earth, just saying his uncle had no conscience. And he was drunk all the time, and he worked little Christmas Evans like a slave, just worked him to death on the farm. And so in these crucial years of Christmas Evans' life, they were spent in pain and distress and agony. And of course, because of this, he downgraded into and got into the wrong crowd and got very involved with sin, became drunk like his uncle. And to put in the words of one man while describing his life, he was set on an early destruction by the way his life was going. But around the age of 19, there was a revival going on in the country of Wales among the Presbyterian churches at the time. And young Christmas Evans went there under a preacher by the name of David Davies. And he was saved there in that Presbyterian revival. And soon he was illiterate too at the age. He could not read a word at the age of 19. And soon, because he was saved, he wanted to learn to read the Bible, of course. And because of that, him and a lot of the other young people that got saved in that revival took all the money they could get, and they started spending it on candles, and they would rent. They were too poor to buy books, so they would rent or borrow books from other people. And they started gathering in barns across the country of Wales, and they would stay up late burning candles, learning how to read. And within a few short months, Christmas Evans learned to read the Bible in the Welsh language. Welsh and English are two different languages. And so he learned how to read because of his conversion and because of the money that they had by buying the candles and all. Now, perhaps we should also say this. While it was very interesting, Christmas Evans he did not have much education, really only about 3 months in total for all of his life. But he went on later on in his life to be very fluent in English and Latin and Hebrew and Greek, which is quite impressive. There are many scholars today that could not have done what he did with those languages. As a matter of fact, he put a scholar to flight one time by simply proving to him he knew much more about the languages than he did. So that's just an interesting little side note there. But this is also a very important part of his life. Soon after his conversion, as I've said, he fell into sin before he got saved and started hanging around with the wrong crowd, started drinking. And after he was saved, of course, he refused to do that anymore. And because of that, his former friends, they grew to hate the new man he had become. And they hate him so much that they tried to kill him. And one night he was walking home in the dark, just down an old country road, and 6 of his former colleagues jumped him and they started beating him with sticks. They wanted to beat him to death. And so after unmercifully beating him, they left him for dead, but he managed to survive, but he lost an eye in the process, and that's how he became known as the one-eyed preacher. Now, soon after this conversion and soon after he started studying his Bible more, he felt it was his call to preach. He felt that was God's calling on his life. So he got his first opportunity to preach in a little cottage meeting. They had many cottage meetings. They just gather in a house, and they'd invite a young preacher to come preach for them, and that's what he did. And so he was up there preaching, and it was going decently well. But one of the men in the audience realized he had memorized his sermon from a book of sermons of another preacher. And so after the service was over, the man said, well, I'm going to go call him out for this. I'm going to call him out as a fake. But at the end of his preaching, Christmas Evans said a prayer, and the man was so impressed by the prayer that he decided, well, I'm just going to leave him. He'll learn eventually. If the man had just been a bit more studious, he would have realized that Christmas Evans, too, memorized the prayer from a book of prayers. And so his first meeting was a little less than original, we'll put it that way. But so he started preaching more, and I think before we continue here, I believe I should talk a little bit about the different style and different attitude of the Welsh people in their preaching. It's very interesting. And so the Welsh people were very, I guess the best word to describe them would be emotional, a very emotional people. And the preaching, too, if the Welsh preachers from Christmas Evans Day were still alive today and were to come preach for us, we would probably say they're showy. We'd say they act like they're putting on a show, or it's just a big play for them. But they really weren't trying to be. That's generally who they are. They weren't trying to be showy. That's just, the Welsh people are very emotional people, and that's how they were. And so that's just an important concept to remember. And I've read behind many of Christmas Evans' sermons, and they're great sermons. I love to read behind them. But very different. I would compare it to reading behind John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, or maybe reading an old Shakespeare play. Something of that sort. It's just very, very different, very interesting. You'll have to read them for yourself. You can find them online. But so Christmas Evans began to preach and began to study his Bible. And after reading and studying, he started to see some things, started to be convicted of some things. And at age 21, 2 or 3 years after he was saved in the Presbyterian church, he joined the Baptist church because of what he was seeing and what he was convicted of. And he came under the pastor, the Reverend Timothy, or Timmy Thomas, as they called him. Now, this man was a very interesting man. Just to kind of further explain to you how different the Welsh people were, they were really pioneers. The Welsh land was wilderness back in those days, and Timothy Thomas was a great man of God, no doubt. I could tell many stories about him preaching, but I'll tell you one of his more humorous accounts to kind of describe the Welsh people to you. One day, Reverend Timothy Thomas and his wife were riding through the country in their horse and buggy when they were jumped by 4 bandits. Well, Timothy Thomas grabbed a stick and instantly beat down 2 of them. And then he broke the stick on the second one, so he ran over to a nearby fence and pulled up the fence post and started beating the 3rd one with it. And when he did the 4th one, decided it's just not worth it, and he ran away. So that's just somewhat of what the Welsh people were. Kind of give you an idea of how different they were. But as Christmas Evans began to preach more and to study more, he began to grow in his popularity. He began preaching a lot of places, and he became so fervent in his service of the Lord that he literally declined in health. I mean, his health just went downhill terribly. And so this, I've tried to wrap my mind about this. He decided, as many Welsh preachers did back then, whenever their health would go down, they would decide they were going to regain their health by going on a preaching tour. It's not the average thing that a preacher today would do when they want to regain health. They don't go on a preaching tour. But it's what Christmas Evans did. He went on a preaching tour, started traveling the country, preaching 3 times a day. And somehow or another, it worked. He got his health back and began preaching like normal again. But I should say, when Christmas Evans, the time he really stepped out on the spotlight and when he really became a great man of God was at the Baptist Association meeting in Langley, Wales. Now, this was an open-air meeting, much like the old-fashioned tent meetings or arbor or camp meetings, as we would call them. And he was the last choice that day, believe it or not. The story goes that they had two great preachers already going to preach for them, but they needed an opening preacher for it all. And so the man in charge of the meeting started going around to the different preachers attending, asking them if they would preach, and none of them would accept it. And he went to Timothy Thomas, and he said, will you preach for me? He said, and Timothy Thomas denied. He said, I won't preach for you. But he said, why don't you ask the one-eyed lad from the north? I hear he preaches wonderfully. Now, you have to understand how Christmas Evans looked at this time. He was never a very good-looking man. Of course, his one eye was something, but he was tall, skinny, very bony. He didn't have great clothes on, and people really thought he was a beggar while he was at the camp meeting. And so much so that when it was announced that he was going to get up to preach, many of the preachers and people in the congregation left to get refreshments, because they said, well, he's not going to preach anything worthwhile, so we're going to go get refreshed and wait for the better preachers to get up to preach. And so not starting off very well. But as he started to preach, he started warming up to his subject, and he really got preaching. And the Lord really started blessing him, and before long, there was not a person that was not under that open-air meeting to hear him preach. And in the Welsh people's term, they said he caught the Hule. It's spelled H-Y-W-L-E. The Hule is an old Welsh word. And the best way to describe catching the Hule, as the Welsh people say, it's like when you're up there preaching, and it's like you're just sitting back and watching God do all the work while you're just sitting there reaping it all in. And that was often used in the Welsh preaching. You often hear them say they caught the Hule. And that's what Christmas Evans did that day. He caught the Hule. And since that day on, he became one of the most requested preachers in the country of Wales. And so that's kind of how he skyrocketed or jumped off into his great ministry. And soon after that, the Baptist Association in the Welsh country decided they were going to send him to the island of Anglesey. If you look, Anglesey is at the top of the country of Wales. And he was married at this time to his wife. And they lived in the same home on that island of Anglesey for 20 years on a salary of $300 a year. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, how in the world can a man live off of $300 a year? Well, you have to understand $300 were worth a lot more back then than it is now. It was still by no means a great salary, but it was enough to get them by. It should also be said Christmas Evans was a pretty tall man. Accounts varies, but he was somewhere between 6 to 7 foot tall. And he was so tall, in fact, that their little house on the island of Anglesey, he could not stand upright in. He had to bend down, and this later on brought hunchback on for him later on in his life. And their house was really just a room. It was like a big shed, really, just one room. The kitchen, dining room, his study, everything, the living room was all just one room. And they lived there for 20 years. And it was quite amazing, really. But he grew to be so great in his ministry. His ministry was so successful. He was so greatly used of God that they literally had to build more churches to hold the converts that were being saved under his ministry. I mean, we're talking hundreds being saved at a time. And true conversions. These are not fake little just sayings, just professions. No, these are real. And they had to build churches to hold all the new converts. And something about his preaching style that the new churches always said, they said, whenever Christmas Evans would get up to preach, that one eye of his, they said, you could not escape that one eye. It was like it was always looking at you. And it was very intimidating while he was preaching, just to have that one eye. You couldn't escape from it. It didn't matter if you were in the back, behind somebody, that one eye was always looking at you. And so that kind of put a little bit of intimidation upon them. But up to this point, we have spoke a lot about his backstory and all. But now for the rest of the podcast, I would just like to talk a little bit about the more spiritual side of Christmas Evans, if we could. It is said that one of Christmas Evans' secret to success was that, and these are his own words, he would lay hold on all the promises of God in Christ with such earnestness as if it were impossible for him to be denied. And he would not let go until he obtained the blessing. Much like Jacob in the Old Testament, he would not let go until he obtained that blessing from the Lord, neither would Christmas Evans. He often wrestled in prayer. He was a great man of prayer. And another part of his secret was that he knew how to plead the promises of God. I know many preachers and many Christians in general, we would all do well, I think, to learn to plead the promises of God. But he often prayed. He was not great. He was not eloquent in prayer. He often prayed the same thing over and over again. He once prayed, they once were having a meeting, and they held a prayer meeting for the deacons and the men of the church that wanted to pray before the meeting started, and he prayed the same request 13 times. And one of the deacons was going to chastise him for it after service. I don't know why, but the deacon was going to chastise him for it after service. But after Christmas Evans finished preaching, they had 13 new converts. He prayed 13 times and had 13 people get saved. And the deacon was forced to swallow his own pride on that occasion. I'll say it like that. Another thing about him, he would not go into the pulpit unless he knew God was with him. He would not. You couldn't force him to get in the pulpit unless he knew the presence of God was with him that day. And he believed that there was a direct connection between his devotion and prayer and his effectiveness in ministry. If that's the case, I believe we should all pray more for our ministry's sake and for the Lord's sake. But that's what he believed. He believed there was a direct connection between his devotion and prayer and his effectiveness in ministry. He said this. This was one of his quotes. "There are many men who make long prayers in public while they scarcely bend the knee in secret." That's great, isn't it? Few men pray in secret while they're praying a long, flowery prayer in public. Secret prayer, that's what Christmas Evans focused on, secret prayer. And he made many covenants with God, written down covenants, and I've read many of them. They're great, fantastic. I love to read them. And he wrote multiple of them. And I just want to read you some excerpts of them. I could not read all of them. I would be sitting here many hours if I were to read you all of them, but I'll just read a few, just some excerpts of them. He said, "Grant me the great favor of being led by thee," of course talking about God, "according to thy will, by the directions of thy providence and word, and this disposing of my own mind by thy Spirit for the sake of thine infinitely precious blood. Help me to wait silently and patiently upon thee for the fulfillment of these things, and not become enraged, angry, and speak unadvisedly with my lips like Moses, a servant of the Lord. Sustain my heart from sinking, to wait for fresh strength from Zion. I give my soul and body unto thee, Jesus the true God and everlasting life. Deliver me from sin and from eternal death, and bring me into everlasting life. O Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, take for the sake of thy cruel death my time and strength and the gifts and talents I possess, which with the full purpose of heart I concentrate to thy glory in the building up of thy church in the world, for thou art worthy of the hearts and talents of all men. And the last one, I give myself in a particular manner to thee, O Jesus Christ the Savior, to be preserved from the falls into which many stumble, that thy name and thy cause may not be blasphemed or wounded, that my peace may not be injured, that thy people may not be grieved, and that thine enemies may not be hardened. That's great, isn't it? He also, I don't have it written down, but he would also make covenants with God, asking him to not let him stay any longer than he was useful for. He'd say, Lord, take me out of this world before I can no longer be useful for you. If I can't have a use for you, then Lord, I don't even know what I'm living for. That's what he would say often. And a saying, this was not his saying, but a saying by another preacher of his time, which he strongly believed was this, and this is a great saying: unless we're favored with frequent revivals and a strong, powerful work of the Spirit of God, we shall in a great degree degenerate and have only a name to live. Religion will lose its vigor. The ministry will hardly retain its luster, and iniquity will abound. He took that to heart, and he always worked so that iniquity would never abound, and he always worked so that there would be revival. It's always what he worked toward. He also said more of God's work is achieved in a single Lord's Day of awakening than in years of preaching. I know many a preacher and many a church member that would do good to take that to heart. So would I. He should be best remembered as a man of prayer, absolutely. And he did not worry about the philosophy of prayer or the theology of prayer. He just simply prayed, and God answered his prayers. This has been a simple segment today. And the life of Christmas Evans, I've quite thoroughly enjoyed studying about it. And you can study about him yourself. There's some books written on him. And you can look, I think there's a video or two that you can find on YouTube about Christmas Evans. But a great man. I've greatly enjoyed this. I hope in some way that today this little segment has been a blessing to you. Hey, from the Higher Grounds podcast to you, keep pressing on the upward way.